I think there are 3 things you should learn before trying to write songs. Let's talk about it. The first thing that I think is really important to learn in order to start songwriting is the music theory concept of keys. This is really very simple. Just learning what keys have what notes and what keys have what chords is going to be very, very important for you as a songwriter. If you take the short time it takes to learn keys well, you will write better and you will write much, much more efficiently. And specifically, I think there are 3 different elements that are really important to know about keys. One is what notes you have in the context of a key. The second thing is what chords you have in the context of a key. And then the third thing is sort of off of that second thing. It really is understanding what the job of each chord is in the context of that key. So for example, let's take D major. In D major, knowing you have the notes D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, as your notes is going to be very helpful. As you're writing your melody, as you are coming up with the piano part or the guitar part, you know what notes you have to work with. You know what notes you can utilize in your melody. Also, knowing what chords you have in the key is going to be very important. For example, let's go with D major again. In the context of D major, an E major chord is probably not really going to work because the normal chord that you would use in the context of D major is an E minor chord. Now, a major 2 chord is something that is sometimes used, but it's usually something you want to use on purpose and not by accident. It's also important to know what chords you have in the context of a key. So for example, in the context of D major, you wouldn't want to have a C major chord because actually what you have is a C sharp diminished chord in the context of the key of D major. It's also important to know the job of each chord in the context of the key. So for example, in the context of D major, a D major chord functions as the 1 chord. Therefore, it functions sort of as that home resolution sounding chord. But in the context of G major, a D major chord would actually function as the 5 chord. And a 5 chord wants desperately to go back to a 1 chord. So in the context of the key of G major, a D major chord would actually really want to go back to a G major chord. If what I just said sounded like another language, I have a free guide for you. It's about the 4 different pillars of music theory that I think every single songwriter needs to know. Guess what? One of them is keys. So if you want to learn about keys, just download that free guide. Link in the description down below if you're interested. But let's move on to number 2. The second thing that I think is really important for a songwriter to learn is instrument improvisation. I think the most important instrument you can learn to do improv on would be whatever instrument is your main instrument. So if you're mostly a guitarist, learn to improvise on the guitar. If you're mostly a pianist, learn to improvise on the piano. Hey, if you play multiple instruments, then learn to improvise on multiple instruments. And the great thing here is if you learn keys that I talked about before, improvisation becomes much more easy. So for example, when I'm sitting at the piano and I think to myself, I'm gonna do some songwriting right now, I can just think to myself, let's start in E major, say. And then I know what notes I have to work with, and I know what chords I have to work with, and I know the job of each chord in the context of the key of E major. So learning keys and learning instrument improvisation actually go very well together. You really need to know keys in order to know how to improvise, and improvisation becomes much easier if you learn keys. And the reason I think it's really important to learn how to improvise is that improvisation is really the heart of songwriting to me. Songwriting doesn't usually look like somebody sort of sitting down and writing music physically on a piece of paper or on their computer. It usually starts with you sitting at an instrument and improvising and doing different things that you're making up as you go along. And eventually you do something that you're like, hey, that's pretty cool. And then you repeat it a couple of times, maybe you record it, and then you're like, okay, what can I do with this? How do I grow this from a cool little riff I played on the piano to a full song? And that's really where songwriting starts. The third thing I think you should learn is poetry. Now, when I say poetry, I am not talking about rhyming per se. I do think rhyming is somewhat important, but honestly, a lot of poems don't rhyme, a lot of songs don't rhyme, and personally, I think rhyming is one of the most overrated things in songs. Most people don't even really know whether the songs they love rhyme or not. Half the time, I don't even think it really matters. Personally, if you've listened to the podcast before or been here before, you've probably heard me talk about how rhyming is one of the most overrated things, especially by beginner songwriters, where they sort of force rhymes and then they kind of ruin their lyrics by forcing rhymes that aren't really there. But anyway, soapbox aside, I think it's important though to learn meter. Meter is a very important concept in poetry. It's really about the number of syllables and also where the emphases lie within those syllables. Meter is going to be very important for your lyrics in order order to match well with the melody so that your emphases are on the right parts of the melody. For example, you don't want that belted high note to be the word the. And you also don't want your lyrics to just sound like people saying words except with pitch. You want your lyrics to actually sound poetic. That's what lyrics are. They should follow meter. So learning meter is something that I think is really important. So in review, there are 3 main things that you should learn before starting to songwrite. One is keys. The second thing is learning how to improvise on your instrument, or hey, you can also just learn to improvise with your voice. I think you should do both personally. And then the third thing that you should learn is poetry, specifically meter in poetry. If you found this video helpful, be sure to drop a like on the video. And if you are interested in learning about keys specifically and the other 3 pillars of music theory that I really think are important for songwriters, be sure to pick up my free guide. Link in the description again down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.